Nebraska. They call it flyover country, a vast expanse of corn and farmland stretching on for hundreds of miles. Nebraska is the third largest producer of corn in the United States, supplying the world's people and livestock with an abundant supply of food. This is no small feat. Most people, however, don't usually flock to a state to watch the corn grow, though millions from around the world do visit each year to experience Cornhusker football, a chance to meet billionaire Warren Buffett, or maybe even take in the sights of Omaha's world-renowned zoo. No matter why you're here, as you speed down Interstate 80 cutting across the state, if you look closely, you might notice the unassuming town of Kearney, located squarely in central Nebraska. America's heartland, the Great Plains. Kearney is best known for the hundreds of thousands of sandhill cranes who take up a temporary home along the Platte River near the city each spring, bringing streams of tourists to witness the annual migration of this marvelous bird. But nestled within the city, away from the tourist attractions and charming downtown, sits a small Orthodox Christian church. Parishioners of this church know something that few outside of the Midwest, and even few inside of it, know: that their founding pastor was instrumental in cultivating the fields of the Orthodox faith in the United States. The life of Nicola Yanney begins in 1873 in a region of northern Lebanon known as the Korah, located near the famous Balamand Monastery. Born to parents Elias and Catherine, Nicola grew up surrounded by a rich tapestry of agricultural life. Olive orchards covered the plains, and rich fruit trees grew plentifully on the weathered hilltops. Small villages peppered the countryside, with clusters of limestone homes set against the rich blue of the nearby seacoast. Inhabitants of the region proudly trace their lineage to the Phoenician traders who had built their civilization along the shores. Nicola's ancestors had seen other great empires rise and fall. Assyrians, Persians, Romans, all had laid claim to the land, only to disappear with time. The region's rich history saw biblical prophets and even the apostles themselves preaching the gospel and establishing churches as they spread out across the Mediterranean, walking the very roads that Nicola himself would have traveled. Nicola's early life, like most children in the region, was spent balancing the demands of work, family, and faith, and receiving his religious education from the local monks of the nearby monastery.
And his family, like many families in the villages that lived around there, had close relations with the monks. They would go there on feast days. The monks ran a school, and so we know Father Nicola was educated. He would have learned to read and write from the monks. He would have learned theology, scripture, all these things in the Orthodox school run by the monks.
His family worked hard on their farm and earned a meager living, selling what little the soil could produce. Money was scarce and became all the more so with the opening of the Suez Canal. The Korah's economy had once thrived on silk production, but with the opening of the canal, cheap imports from China flooded the region, hurting local farmers. Nicola and his family, like all Christians in the Korah, suffered greatly under the Ottoman Empire. Christian farmers, already struggling to survive, were forced to pay heavy taxes to the empire in order to work and to worship in their churches. Though persecution had eased somewhat during Nicola's early life, his family kept ever present the memory of the brutality they had endured shortly before Nicola's birth.
His parents and older siblings had remembered a time of great religious persecution called the Massacre of 1860, where thousands, tens of thousands of people being massacred, many Christians, villages and churches burnt to the ground. So while Father Nicola grew up in a time of relative peace, things were beginning to get more problematic. Religious tensions were rising again. It was getting harder economically to survive. And at the same time, the borders to the New World were open.
Faced with mounting tension from a collapsing economy and pressure from a hostile government, Nicola knew he had to make a drastic change. Many of his friends and family had already made the long trek to America, and those who came back spoke of wide open landscapes full of financial opportunity. But Nicola was not only concerned about providing for himself and his family. Approaching the age of 19, he was soon to be married, and the financial needs of his wife and future children pressed heavily upon him. Nicola's wife, Martha, was a petite young woman with dark eyes and brown hair. Martha was a devout Orthodox Christian and had spent much of her youth visiting the local Balaman monastery with her family. Soon after their wedding, Nicola and Martha began making their plans to leave the Cora. Finances were tight, but a small loan secured through a family friend was just enough for Nicola and Martha to obtain tickets on a steamship and adequate supplies to survive their long journey across the Atlantic. Although many were leaving the region for larger cities in America, like New York and Chicago, to find their fortunes, Nicola would be taking a less conventional route. His journey from home would take him to the city of Omaha, Nebraska, where he and Martha would join a small but growing community of Orthodox Christians from the Cora. In early 1893, Nicola and Martha embarked on a grueling journey aboard a steamship bound for the United States. The ship's accommodations were less than ideal, with scores of travelers packing the small, dimly lit living quarters. Nicola and Martha were overcome by the stench as they filed into the dingy compartments. After 26 days of enduring terrible conditions aboard the steamship, the Yanneys finally arrived at Ellis Island.
So Father Nicola would have been on a packed ship and would have arrived at Ellis Island with thousands and thousands of other immigrants and gone through like he was kind of a piece of cattle, with the immigration officials, gotten inspected, the whole 9 yards, and it was quite an ordeal.
Having obtained a clean bill of health from the inspectors at Ellis Island, Nicola and Martha embarked by rail, bound for the vast interior of the United States. The destination? Omaha, Nebraska. Once arriving in Omaha, Nicola and Martha took up residence in the Lebanese section of town in a small one-bedroom apartment. Eager to repay the small loan that secured his passage to America, Nicola quickly began working as a peddler.
So this is the days before Sears catalog, and so people would travel through the countryside with either their carriages or, as Father Nicola did, at least at first, with a 50 to 70 pound backpack on, carrying all sorts of items. Some might be exotic things made in the Holy Land, things that their wives had made for them to sell, or just needle, threads, flatware, shirts, fabric, anything they could sell. And they would travel all over the city. If they lived in a big city, then many of them would travel outside. They would travel through a state. They could travel through a whole region, multiple states. Some of them would be gone for 6 months at a time. Some would be gone for maybe a month at a time. Father Nicola would be gone for about a month at a time. He'd travel from Omaha all through Nebraska and maybe beyond, and then he would go home every 3 or 4 weeks.
Traveling the plains as a peddler allowed Nicola to quickly become familiar with the new American landscape, all the while earning a good living, paying down his debt, and putting money aside for the needs of his family. Though peddling paid well, Nicola was frequently away from home for weeks at a time, a situation with which Martha grew increasingly weary. But it wasn't just Nicola's long treks away from home that began to worry Martha. Omaha was a much larger and more dangerous city than both her and Nicola were accustomed to. As their concerns with big city life grew, so did their family. Martha gave birth to their first child, Elias, in October of 1893, and to their first daughter, Anna, in July of 1895. Their small one-bedroom was simply not enough. Nicola and Martha began planning their exit from Omaha.
Father Nicola found a homestead, and it was about 20 miles outside of Kearney. And so he decided to return to his family's ancestral vocation of farming. So he got a quarter section out in the middle of nowhere, and that's where he and his wife started their farm. They lived in a small 2-room soddy Eventually, Father Nicola brought one of his younger brothers over, and they worked together on the farm like he grew up, farming, but in a quiet place, not in the big city.
The story of Father Nicola, as I've begun to get to know it, is a story about a man who leaves everything behind and comes to try to make a new life in the new world. A very common story in that period of immigration. But he doesn't go to where a lot of people think about immigration. He doesn't go to New York City, a place where a lot of immigrants are gathering, but instead comes to be a farmer out on the plains of Nebraska. That's astounding sort of in itself, that you would travel all that distance to live a very humble life in a place that even now is forgotten, frankly, by most of even this country. Most people don't think about Nebraska that often, and certainly not Kearney, Nebraska. It's a town that most people have never even heard of.
At the same time that Nicola and Martha were settling into their new life near Kearney, events were put into motion across the country that would change not only Nicola's life, but the entire course of Orthodox history in the United States. In 1893, at the request of the newly organized Syrian Orthodox Benevolent Society, Archimandrite Raphael Hawawini arrived in New York City to begin ministering to the growing Syrian population, leaving a prestigious teaching position behind at the Russian Orthodox Theological School in Kazan, Russia. Father Raphael, known today as Saint Raphael of Brooklyn, was an accomplished churchman, scholar, and native of Damascus, Syria, a clear choice to begin organizing the new Syrian Orthodox Church in America.
St. Raphael was an extremely restless person who loved to be on the move. He couldn't sit still his whole life. That's the reason why he was constantly moving around when he was in Syria. It's part of the reason why he went to Russia. He was moving around there. He came to America. America was like the ultimate job for St. Raphael because he could travel constantly to teach orthodoxy. The ultimate job for him. When he kept getting offered jobs back in Syria, back in the Patriarchate, to come back and become a bishop, he could have become Patriarch of Antioch. There's no question in my mind, had he gone back to Syria, he would have become Patriarch of Antioch. But that would have been a horrible job for him, because he would have been stuck in Damascus and in this small, relatively geographically small patriarchate, whereas he had the whole of America to travel around and take care of people. So God put St. Raphael into the job that was perfectly suited for his talents and his skills and his personality.
On one of his visits, he came to Omaha in 1898 and met many of the Orthodox Christians there who were from this little village near the Balaman Monastery. He came back the next year and found that they had almost all moved to Kearney. So he got on a train and came over to Kearney. And there's a beautiful account of his arrival. He wrote a diary entry about it. The people were so hungry to see and meet an Orthodox priest. Many of these people had been here for years and years. They didn't go to other churches. They prayed at home. They read scripture. But they hadn't had confession. They hadn't had communion. They hadn't been able to have their marriages blessed. They hadn't been able to have their children baptized for years. And so this was St. Raphael's great ministry, was going all across the country. He came here. His train was 8 hours late. The people, it was close to midnight. They were still waiting for him on the train platform. So he stayed up till 4 a.m. talking with them. But he was exhausted from his travels and he was sick. So he was supposed to serve the liturgy for them, but he wasn't able to serve the liturgy for them the next morning. But by later in the afternoon, he was feeling better. And the people here, so this is 1899, had a dear friend, Nicola Yanney, and his brother, and Martha, his wife, and their children. And they were the only ones who lived far out of Kearney. They lived about 18 miles away. And they knew that the Yanneys would never hear that an Orthodox priest had come.
Intrigued and eager to meet Nicola, Father Raphael and several members of the community set out immediately by wagon that very night to the Yanney homestead. Though it was Father Raphael's mission to minister to the scattered Syrian people and to administer the sacraments of the Church, he had another motive in mind for his extensive travels: to find worthy candidates to ordain to the priesthood and share in his vast missionary activity.
About 9 p.m., he and 15 of the Yanney's friends got in 4 wagons. It was a full moon. It was a warm night in September. And they drove all the way out to the Yanney's homestead. And when they got to the homestead, they started shooting their pistols in the air and yelling in Arabic to wake the Yanneys up. And Nicola and his brother and wife ran out of the house like they didn't know what was going on. And then they saw St. Raphael. They saw this Orthodox priest. And it's a really beautiful, very moving account. They fell down on their knees, weeping, kissing his hands, kissing his feet. Martha Yanney, Father Nicola's wife, was just weeping. And she just couldn't believe it. She just was frozen, and her hands lifted to the heavens and thanking God for this. And so they stayed up late with their friends, and at that time, Archimandrite Raphael, St. Raphael, stayed up late into the night. It was about 1 a.m. when they got there. Everyone fell asleep wherever they could find a place in their small 2-room sadi. And then when they got up in the morning, St. Raphael served orthros, served matins, blessed the livestock, blessed the farm. I spent the afternoon with them, and then their friends, along with St. Raphael, got in their wagons and came back to Kearney. And a day or two later, the Yanneys packed their family up, and then they drove into Kearney, stayed with friends, and there they, for the first time in 7 years, had confession with St. Raphael, had liturgy with him, and then their 4 children, they had 4 children at the time, were baptized.
Though Father Raphael was only in Kearney for a few days, the joy of the community was not soon forgotten. However, it would be the last time that Martha Yanney would ever see a priest. Tragedy struck the Yanney household.
A few years after St. Raphael had visited, Martha Yanney, Father Nicola's wife, died in childbirth. And there was no one there to bury her, and there was no one there to confess her or anoint her. And so Father Nicola and his family and friends took her to a cemetery that some of their Irish-American immigrant friends, a family cemetery they had, and they allowed the Yanneys to bury Martha there. And the child survived, but 8 days later died. And so Father Nicola buried his wife and his daughter. So he's a widower at the age of 29 with 4 young children. The local community really wanted a church. And at that point, there were 4 churches. St. Raphael, during his years, his 8 years of ministry, between 1895 and 1903, had founded 4 official churches, all on the East Coast, all with hundreds of Syrian and Lebanese Orthodox families. The congregation here in Kearney was maybe 20 families, maybe 30 families. It had grown since his last visit, but they wanted a church, and they wrote to St. Raphael. He was headquartered in New York, and they promised that they would provide a salary for a priest if he would send them one. He didn't have anyone to send. There were only a handful of Orthodox priests in America at the time, only a handful of Syrian Orthodox priests, and many communities to serve. He had no one to send. But he asked the community, he said, if you can provide a building in which to worship and a salary for a priest, and if you can choose a man from among your own community who's worthy of the priesthood, send him to me. I'll ordain him, I'll train him, and I'll send him back to you as a priest. So the community got the funds together. They bought an old unused schoolhouse. They turned it into a church. They moved it from out in the countryside into town, near where a few of them lived. And then the question was, who could be their priest? Nicola Yanney, Father Nicola, before he was ordained, was a real lay leader. He was a lay leader, prominent. Many people respected him. Everyone liked him. Everyone looked up to him. And he was known to be very well-educated, very educated in his faith. These are people who'd known him all of his life. These are his friends, his relatives, whom he'd grown up with in his home village. And they had seen how he had grieved, but how he'd not lost his faith. So they asked him. And that was a big sacrifice. He still was raising his 4 young children. And in choosing to become a priest and choosing to accept ordination, he knew he could never remarry. But he accepted it.
Kearney is unique because Kearney did choose one of their own as their priest. That isn't something that was just happening all over the place. There were other communities that did sort of choose their own priest, but they were bringing someone over from the old country who was already a priest. But for someone who was just one of the community to be selected, that was unusual. So Father Nicola was devout, he was faithful, he had shown perseverance, he was reliable, dependable, somebody that they could trust, that they knew. They, in many cases, in his community, had known him for a long time, and so they trusted him.
The fact that he said yes says something about his character. He would have been completely justified in saying, I can't do that. I'm just trying to take care of my kids. You know, I'm so far from home. I'm just trying to make ends meet out here, you know. But he received this call, not just from his bishop, but from his community. You know, his community said, we want you to be the one who prays with us, to be the one who celebrates liturgy for us, the one who hears our confessions. And the bishop confirmed that, the saintly bishop, Raphael. And that to me is a distinguishing mark of his life, as I've come to understand it, is that he receives the call, and just like the prophet Isaiah, he says, here am I, send me. He says, okay, I'll be the one. I'll do that thing. And he keeps saying yes over and over and over again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard.
Having been chosen by the community and having accepted the call to the holy priesthood, Nicola still had to prove to Father Raphael that he was worthy of the role. To that end, a priest was sent from New York to Kearney to hear Nicola's lifetime confession. Satisfied with Nicola's exemplary life, the priest returned to New York, leaving Nicola with instructions to await word from Father Raphael.
Late winter, early spring of 1904, St. Raphael, who at that point is an archimandrite, still a priest, became the first Orthodox man to be consecrated to the episcopacy in the New World. So he's the first Orthodox bishop, made a bishop in the New World. And that happened in New York. And when they knew that that was going to happen, they communicated, sent message to Kearney, and they raised funds here, and they sent Nicola to New York City. And he was there for a few months. He was ordained just about a week or two after St. Raphael was consecrated as a bishop. So St. Raphael is the first man, Orthodox man, to be consecrated bishop in the New World. And the first man that he ordained to the priesthood is Nicola Yanney.
In ordaining Nicola to the holy priesthood, Bishop Raphael was seeking to expand his own mission in serving the scattered Syrian flock. Though Nicola was assigned to the newly formed St. George Parish in Kearney, his priestly duties would take him across the United States, building on the foundation laid by Bishop Raphael.
and from the day of his ordination. This is a brand new priest. Brand new priest. Father Nicola was given the same mission to cover the Great Plains, essentially. So for the next 10 years, he did that. St. Raphael had other places to be, other communities to found, other people to minister to, and he left at least the central part of the United States basically in the hands of Father Nicola. Every once in a while, another priest would come from the East Coast to serve a community, but once Father Nicola is ordained, it's primarily him. It's mostly him. And so he's visiting communities he's pastoring this congregation. It eventually grew to about 250 people. He's making annual or semi-annual, sometimes he's visiting certain communities 3 or 4 times a year. North Dakota, South Dakota, all across Nebraska, Kansas, all across Oklahoma. He's going into Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. He goes as far as Alabama and even Pennsylvania and into New York a few times. Mostly it's that central corridor that is his missionary territory. And so he's going around to farms, to apartments, to homes where multiple Orthodox families are living, baptizing their children, blessing their marriages, anointing and confessing people, and carrying his gospel book. We have his gospel book at church, here in the church, the gospel book that he used, that he traveled with, that he used here in this congregation. So all his vestments, everything that he needs, he's carrying with him on the train, and he's gone, sometimes for a week at a time, often for a month or 2 at a time, often for 3, 4, 5, 6 months at a time. This is the first, at least in the Antiochian Archdiocese, this is the first parish in Kearney, Nebraska, west of the Mississippi, with a resident priest. And this was a missionary center. And so from St. George, Father Nicola was going around in a circuit, responding to he had scheduled visits and then he had unexpected visits, crises, pastoral calls that, he had to drop his plans and leave on. His missionary territory is larger than our current Diocese of Wichita, Mid-America, but basically that's the area that he served a lot. And so thousands of Orthodox Christians, he was their pastor. They might only seen him once a year or 3 or 4 times a year, but he was their pastor. The oldest parishes in this region, the oldest Antiochian parishes, were first served and regularly served by Father Nicola Yanney. So that's, I think, a tremendous heritage. And if we think about the fact that he baptized close to 1,000 people, and he chrismated a few too, and they weren't all Syrian and Lebanese. There were some Greeks and there were some Romanians. Like St. Raphael, his primary ministry was to Lebanese and Syrian Orthodox people. But he was called upon and ministered to any Orthodox people or Americans who wanted to convert to Orthodoxy. He did that too. So he really served the people here as the oldest parishes in this region developed to the point where they would be parishes. And then they followed the same pattern. They became churches. They became capable of supporting a priest, and they were given a priest. And then that priest would do the same thing that Father Nicola did. He would serve scattered families and small communities. So he's really kind of the pattern of the missionary activity that happened in this region. And really it was happening in other places too by other priests. But he most certainly in the Antiochian Archdiocese, what is called now, back then in the Syrian diocese, he had the largest geographical territory.
keeping Orthodox people Orthodox was a challenge. And so Father Nicola, one of the things that's striking about Father Nicola is how willing he was to sacrifice his own well-being for the sake of that particular mission, for the sake of the mission of ministering to these scattered people. I think the sacrifices Father Nicola made to serve the scattered people that were under his care are more impressive than those made by St. Raphael. So St. Raphael and Father Nicola, they both were great circuit-riding missionaries who were specifically focused on the Arabic-speaking people in America. So they have that in common. And obviously St. Raphael was Father Nicola's model and his mentor. So they had a strong relationship in that regard. The difference with Father Nicola is Father Nicola liked his farm. Father Nicola was like perfectly content to be out on his farm with his family in this little house, tending to his fields. So he didn't have any particular desire to be on the move all the time. Father Nicola was also not a monk. St. Raphael was. Father Nicola had a family. In fact, not only did he have a family, he had kids who didn't have a mom after she died. So Father Nicola, when he traveled, he was sacrificing his time with his kids' well-being, which is a tough pill to swallow as a father. So for Father Nicola to be gone 6 months at a time, sometimes longer, and knowing that his kids are growing up without a mom, and yes, he had his brothers there, and eventually one of his brothers got married, and so, there were some family members there. It's not like he was just leaving them, abandoning them. But he had to make a tough choice, It's almost an impossible choice as a father. Do I serve this mission that God has presented to me, or do I take care of my kids, which is also a godly mission? And that's a hard choice. He had to balance that. And you can see in the letter to his son, you see this painful, almost kind of longing he has to be with his son, that you can sense this is not a man who was detached, who was content to let other people raise his kids. He was actually like a deeply affectionate father who was very connected with his kids. And so leaving his kids behind to go on these missionary journeys, it hurt every time. There's no question. God selected a man who, on paper, was totally not suited for this job. He was a homebody who loved his kids, and his kids needed him desperately. And for some reason, God chose him to be his apostle in the middle of the country.
One of the things that's often mentioned about Father Nicola is how much he suffered. But what's valuable about that point is how he responded to that suffering. As Orthodox Christians, we don't believe that suffering has an inherent value. Its value is that it's an opportunity. And he took that opportunity. The basic narrative of our faith is about death and resurrection. Right? So, in his story, there is especially this death, 2 deaths that happen in quick succession, week and a half between them, not even. His wife and his brand new daughter. And, his wife is young, and of course his daughter has just breathed for 9 days. And then, I think it's less than 2 years later, he's being ordained to the priesthood. At least from where I sit, it looks like a path of death and resurrection. That he passes through death because he experiences the death of people that are so close to him, and then he becomes then a vessel of life. So it is this narrative of resurrection. And where we in the modern world go wrong with our suffering is that we seem to think that it has some kind of inherent value. And then when we discover that it doesn't have that inherent value, then life looks meaningless to us. It becomes nihilistic and absurd, right? But what takes suffering from being darkly absurd to being the possibility for life is this narrative of resurrection.
Even in the face of such hardship, Father Nicola faithfully continued to serve his mission. While away from home, tending to the scattered flock, tragedy would again strike the Yanney family.
One of the saddest stories is that when he is in Colorado, ministering to some Orthodox Christians there, he gets a call that his daughter, his second child was a daughter named Anna, that she's very sick and on the point of death. And so he races home. He hadn't seen her in a month. He had served Pascha. He communed her along with the rest of his children, and the next day left on his missionary journey. And by the time he made it back, she's unconscious and dies the next day. There's no other priest. There's no other priest in 1,000 miles. And so he had to serve his own daughter's funeral.
He doesn't get to say goodbye to her. She dies. He has to serve the funeral because there's no other priest. He doesn't have anyone he can really go to. He stays with his sons, who are mourning the loss now of their sister, and is the whole community, right? The whole community's mourning this death. And so he's got to be with his community. He's there for 2 or 3 weeks, and then he's back on the road. And one of the things that I think you could be tempted to think is like, oh, was he being an escapist? Was he just trying to kind of push away the pain by traveling, by getting back on the road? He's not trying to run away from this. If he had his way, I have no doubt he would have spent all the time that he could in Kearney. But he knew that he had to balance that deep desire as a father and even as a parish priest to be home with the needs of all these people who had their own funerals that needed to be served, or weddings or baptisms, or they haven't had communion in a year. And so he has to make this call, this tough choice. And so he's back on the road again. That to me is a striking example, probably the most striking example until his death, of the extent to which he was willing to sacrifice everything.
The year was 1918. Father Nicola had been dutifully serving the faithful throughout the United States for 10 years. He was 44 years old. The Great War was coming to an end, and America's sons were returning home, and with them came the virus that would kill hundreds of thousands in the United States alone.
In early October, the Spanish flu begins to hit, and people really begin to take notice of it, at least here in this part of the country. And it's infecting so many people and causing fatalities among so many otherwise young and healthy adults that cities and then states began enacting quarantines. Theaters, any place of public congregation, churches shut down, curfews. Here in Kearney, children are not allowed to play out on the street. In some places, they don't know what to do. They're dumping formaldehyde in the streets. This is panic. You read the newspapers of the time, you read the history, and everyone back then is stiff upper lip. We're Nebraskans. Just be calm. It's very frightful. Churches are shut down, and many of his people are falling ill. And so he does what he can. He's a priest. So he goes, he anoints them, he confesses them, he brings them communion, ministering especially to the sick. He does funerals for those who die, just days within him returning home. And it doesn't take long when he gets it too. He becomes sick.
So Father Nicola, he must have started feeling symptoms relatively early on, because by the time we get to the end, it's really the end. But he basically ignores any symptoms that whatever symptoms he's feeling. And in the face of all the danger that was, as dangerous as, some enemy occupying your city, killing anyone on sight. That's the danger he's facing. His people are getting sick. There are people in his community that are dying. He, as he always did, understands that his primary mission is the sacraments and ministering to his people. That's his first priority. Everything else is secondary, including his own health, including his family. The priority is serving this mission that God has given him. And so he completely disregards all danger, goes house to house, giving people communion, and that's how we know he caught the flu. How exactly he caught it, when he caught it, I don't know the details. But he's clearly getting sicker, and he's feeling it, and he's ignoring it, and he's just continuing to give his people communion, to hear their confessions, to give them communion, to hear their confessions, until he just has nothing left, and he basically just collapses. He completely exhausted himself, to the end, serving his people. And by the end, there was nothing left. He said a word to his sons, and then he died. So he didn't have this long illness where he was laying in bed for days as he wasted away. His wasting away was while he was giving communion to his people, till it was time for him to die too, and then he gave himself up. One of the people that comes to mind for me when I think of Father Nicola, I have an association in my mind between him and St. Joseph of Damascus. St. Joseph of Damascus was the parish priest. He was the priest of the cathedral in Damascus. He would have been the priest of the Hallowini family, St. Raphael's family. And in the early 1860s, there was an uprising of the Druze in Damascus, and they massacred a bunch of Christians. And so St. Joseph, as the priest, is going house to house, giving people communion, being with them before because he knows they're going to die. The Druze are coming to kill them, and so he's just trying to prepare them and give them communion. And then when he finally gets cornered by the Druze, he realizes that, it's over. So he takes the rest of the communion, swallows it, and then he's killed. And you think of Father Nicola's death, there's a strong parallel. It wasn't Druze coming to kill Father Nicola, but something was coming to kill Father Nicola. It was killing his people too, and it was the influenza.
His obituaries say that he was ministering to his flock and visiting his parishioners up until the day he died. So on October 28th, he comes home after ministering to his people, exhausted, very sick, falls into bed, and late that night, almost at midnight, some of the records say he died on October 29th. He died about just a little bit before midnight on October 28th.
I think it would have been very easy for Father Nicola to excuse himself and protect himself, right? If he had started feeling symptoms, for example, he's feeling symptoms, he knows people are dying of this. Well, you know what? His community needs a priest, right? The whole region needs a priest. His kids need him. The boys are growing up, but they're not all adults yet, and even the ones that are young adults, they need him. And so he could have made a really good excuse, and I think it would have been completely justified for him to say, okay, I've done what I can, but I need to take care of myself so that I can take care of these people. But there was the good way, and then there was this higher way that was better than an acceptable way. There was what was acceptable, what would not have necessarily been wrong, but then there was this other way that was completely kenotic, completely self-emptying. And so he, in his death, becomes as much like Christ as he can be.
100 years after the death of Father Nicola, his sacrifice continues to inspire the faithful across the United States. Nothing illustrates this better than the hundreds of pilgrims who gathered on October 28, 2018, at St. George Parish in Kearney to learn about and honor this great priest who served across the Great Plains.
I find it very compelling, and I'm excited to get to know his story more, and I'm now excited to tell the story. That's the way that I function, is when I learn about something that I like, or when I learn about a person that I am excited by or inspired by, I want everyone else to be inspired by them as well. So certainly, there's this kind of question that I've been asking myself as I've been here, which is this man a saint? Right? And it's a question that seems to be being asked this weekend. Is he a saint? And in some ways, it's a really valuable question to ask, because we need to think about sanctity and what it means to be a saint. But also, it's kind of the wrong question. We're asking, does he belong in this category? Right? And it's important to have categories. It's important to have canonized saints and so forth. But there's a question that's already been answered, which is, has God worked here through this man in an extraordinary way? Well, obviously the answer is absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. We're drawn here because of the holiness of God. People, even saints, don't have their own holiness. They have God's holiness. And whether someone is a canonized saint or not, or just an ordinary person who maybe one time did an extraordinary thing, it's the work of God there. So that's why we're here for this pilgrimage. Whether we can articulate it that way or not, is we're here because of the work of God. We're here to be part of the work of God. And we recognize that God has done this work through this man. Whether that means someday, I'm going to be singing his hymns in church or not, kind of doesn't matter that much. It's the Christ whom he served that we are drawn to and that we see in him.
He accepted both the involuntary and the voluntary suffering. He saw the involuntary suffering and he raised it, the voluntary suffering. And I think that that's a really powerful thing. If he had done the one but not the other, he wouldn't necessarily be as exceptional. But the fact that he had all this involuntary suffering, and then in the face of that, when he was given the opportunity to suffer more, he chose it. That's amazing. That's amazing. The level of faith that you have to have, that this is all real, that the promises of God are true, that Christ really did become incarnate and die and rise again, and that all of what we believe is true. He had to know that and believe it so deeply, because no one with a little faith or with limited faith or with weak faith could do what he did.
As Antiochian Orthodox Christians, and as just Orthodox Christians living in this part of the country, we are recipients. The Greek word in Scripture, the paradosis, the tradition that's passed down like a baton and received by every generation. We might not be Lebanese or Syrian. We may be Lebanese and Syrian. We may not be in the Antiochian Archdiocese, but some people are direct descendants of the people that he served. Others of us are spiritual descendants of this priest who served selflessly in the heartland, in the Great Plains. So I think as Orthodox Christians living in America, Americans are so detached from history, but as Orthodox, we love history, and we're attached to this huge, worldwide, historical faith. And what an inspiration that, in many ways, he's one of our points of contact, along with St. Raphael, and along with all of our spiritual forebears. And for some people, they're flesh and blood ancestors. Father Nicola is a big part of that story. He's an inspiration because you see, here is this priest, and we think orthodoxy is so new. You know, we're in Nebraska, we're in Missouri, we're in Iowa, we're in Kansas, and we're like, well, hey, we're in North Dakota. The people in North Dakota, he spent a lot of time in North Dakota, a month every year at least, of his priesthood. There's this connection. We have a history. St. Raphael, Father Nicola, other holy and saintly priests and righteous lay people have been here. We have a history. We have a people, in our faith. That's important. And he's just one of those stories, an important part. He's an example of, for a priest, what it means to serve. What it means to serve. The sacrifice, but enduring great tragedy. The death of his wife, the death of 2 of his children, the death of other close relatives. And still remaining faithful. Suffering like Job, but remaining faithful. In imitation of his spiritual father, St. Raphael. Of putting others' needs before his own. Love the Lord your God with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Literally an icon of what it's like in a particularly priestly function, but in a Christian function, in an orthodox way, to love your neighbor. He did that.
The legacy of Father Nicola Yanney is that of a mighty tree, a cedar of Lebanon, a tree which was uprooted from its ancient homeland and replanted in the Wild West, where it began to bear fruit. And while his charge was to minister to the Middle Eastern immigrants, we now see the fruits of the gospel springing up all over America. The past 100 years has seen the roots of orthodoxy take hold in the American soil. It seems that his mission to strengthen the faithful of his homeland is still being fulfilled 100 years after his repose. I think it's no coincidence that Nebraska is the birthplace of Arbor Day. The trees of the plains are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon which thou hast planted, deep roots, abundant fruits. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes.
الضيق دعوت الرب فاستجاب